It is November of 2024, and the United States and China are locked in a high-stakes naval arms race. As China asserts more control over the South China Sea, the chance of an armed conflict drastically increases. There are three primary factors that determine the outcome of any naval conflict. Two of these factors are determined by decades of policy decisions from multiple administrations. The third is built over centuries and is more tied to geography than to nation. The first factor is the number, quality, and concentration of existing vessels at a nation's disposal. It can take many years to complete a large warship, and building a strong fleet requires a long-term funding commitment, both in terms of new ship construction and the upkeep of existing ships. The second factor is industrial capacity. How much tonnage can a nation's shipyards produce per year? Would the country have the resources required to replenish losses during wartime? Warship production goes far beyond the shipyard. A ship needs a propulsion system, navigation systems, weapons systems, and many other components that must be manufactured elsewhere. The raw material that goes into ship components must be mined, refined, and shipped to factories. Any shortfall in the production of any component at any stage in the production process can cause significant delays to construction. The third factor is naval tradition, which can only be built by decades or centuries of experience. China has the largest navy in the world by the number of hulls. The Chinese Navy is centered around 3 aircraft carriers, 2 of which are modified versions of a Soviet design, the Kuznetsov, and one of which is a much newer vessel with the capacity to launch aircraft with a catapult. Catapult-assisted takeoffs allow aircraft to carry heavier payloads. China also operates 8 Renhai-class guided missile cruisers. Though China has been making more of an effort to build larger surface units, most of its navy is still made up of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes. The Chinese Navy has around 40 destroyers, 40 frigates, and around 180 corvettes and missile boats. Though these ships are individually less capable than their U.S. counterparts, they are mostly concentrated in China's home waters. I have also seen more official estimates that place the actual number of Navy corvettes and Navy missile boats at around 110, though the number I was stating earlier could also include some armed Coast Guard ships. The Chinese operate somewhere around 140 Coast Guard vessels. China's submarine forces are still largely reliant on conventionally powered attack submarines. China only possesses 6 nuclear-powered attack submarines and 6 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. The rest of their submarine forces are made up of 47 conventionally powered attack submarines. Most of these numbers were taken from the U.S. Department of Defense's report on the military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China for the year 2023. The United States has the largest navy in the world by tonnage. The U.S. has 10 Nimitz-class aircraft carriers and 1 Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, with several more in production. Each one of these massive supercarriers displaces around 100,000 tons. The U.S. operates around 9 Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruisers. However, they are being phased out in favor of more modern designs, as this design dates back to the 70s and 80s. There were originally going to be 32 Zumwalt-class guided missile destroyers. However, only 3 were produced. With such a reduction from 32 to 3, many of the weapon systems that were specially designed for the Zumwalt class were no longer financially viable and had to be excluded from the final versions of the ships. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer forms the backbone of the current U.S. Navy. They have over 70 of these warships. The U.S. frigate force is very lackluster, only having the littoral combat ships and the Constellation guided missile frigates. The Constellation class is a step up from the littoral combat ships, but it will take a while for there to be substantial numbers of the class. With so few frigates and corvettes, the U.S. Navy is at a distinct disadvantage when compared to the Chinese Navy. The U.S. Navy has a wide array of different submarines. The Los Angeles class, the Seawolf class, and the Virginia class completely outclass anything that the Chinese have in their arsenal. The U.S. also has strong ballistic missile submarines and strong guided missile submarines. The U.S. Navy also operates several amphibious assault ships, which can be configured to act as aircraft carriers. When carrying Harriers or F-35s, these ships can be as effective as many of the carriers operated by our NATO allies. Another important metric when evaluating the quality of a fleet is the number of vertical launch system cells. As of 2024, the United States remains ahead of the Chinese Navy. This means that U.S. warships generally have an advantage over their Chinese counterparts. Additionally, not all vertical launch systems are created equal. The Hellfires on the littoral combat ships, which may be counted into the overall number of vertical launch system cells, don't exactly pack a punch that could take out a major warship. There are also many missile systems that are not in the form of vertical launch cells that are also reasonably capable. As of 2024, the United States has an advantage with its existing warships. Tonnage is generally more important than sheer numbers when determining capabilities. The U.S. suffers from the inability to sufficiently concentrate its forces. Though the United States has excellent fleet logistics, the number of global commitments makes it difficult for the United States to mass its naval forces in a single area. The U.S. does not have enough ships to completely fill its needs in the event of a war. This is largely because U.S. naval production slowed down significantly after the fall of the Soviet Union. The U.S. Navy only spent an average of $13.8 billion on new ship construction per year from 1990 to 2019. There was an attempt under the Trump administration to expand the battle force strength to 355 ships. However, these plans were revised down and then revived. The Navy now claims to need 381 ships to meet campaigning and warfighting demands. However, at present, in 2024, the United States Navy has only 297 active combat force ships. There will need to be a consistent building program that receives consistent funding for the U.S. Navy to be able to meet its warfighting needs. It would also likely be in the Navy's best interest to encourage the creation of new shipyards and encourage the expansion of existing shipyards. The small number of U.S. warships makes force concentration even more important. China is only required to focus on its waters, while the United States has many global commitments. Force concentration, or what percentage of a force can be brought to bear against a single point in the enemy's defenses, is probably the single most important factor when comparing the strength of fleets. Even if a navy has an overall superiority in numbers, a small fleet can defeat them in detail, especially if they are supported by mainland assets. China has a fleet that is more geared towards protecting its territorial waters, while the U.S. Navy is primarily concerned with global force projection. The United States has a large network of global alliances that would provide significant support in the event of a war. The most consequential U.S. allies in the Pacific are Japan, Australia, and South Korea. Out of these three nations, Japan is arguably in the best position to build and maintain a navy, as it is an island nation with a strong economy. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, or knockoff Imperial Japanese Navy, has significant forces. It has 2 light aircraft carriers, the Izumo and Kaga, and 2 helicopter carriers, the Hayuna and Issei. These carriers and helicopter carriers are backed up by a force of around 30 destroyers and 6 frigates. Many of Japan's destroyers are relatively modern and would pose a substantial threat to Chinese warships. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force also has a handful of conventionally powered attack submarines. In recent years, Australia has substantially increased its defense budget, though its navy is still extremely unimpressive compared to other Pacific powers. The Australian Navy only has a handful of destroyers, frigates, and submarines. These ships would likely only be useful for coastal defense of Australia itself. Australia is planning on upgrading its submarine fleet and will likely receive 3 or more Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines from the United States. South Korea's Navy is what the Australian Navy could be if they allocated their resources more efficiently. South Korean shipbuilding is surprisingly efficient and allows them to build ships at a far lower cost than many of their Western competitors. The South Korean Navy operates somewhere around 13 destroyers. These ships are relatively modern and have similar capabilities to their Western counterparts. The South Korean Navy operates around 20 frigates of varying capabilities. Some are very modern, and a few are relatively old. The South Korean Navy also operates a couple of helicopter carriers, which could accommodate VTOL aircraft. Alongside these more major surface combatants, the South Korean Navy operates a wide array of various patrol boats and conventionally powered attack submarines. The United States also has a number of partners in the region that are much smaller than Japan, Korea, or Australia. Taiwan's a prime example of this. It's less economically powerful than any of those three nations, yet it still operates a relatively substantial navy based around old U.S. ships like Kidd-class destroyers and Hazard Perry-class frigates. Having allies, of course, is a two-way street, and as I mentioned earlier in this video, the U.S. has many global commitments. There may be some issues with U.S. force readiness in the short term. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command's stockpiles have been partially depleted by conflicts in the Middle East and by aid shipments to Ukraine. Though the extent of this depletion is unclear, it could be challenging to rebuild those stockpiles on short notice if China was to become aggressive. Samuel Papero, the admiral in charge of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, seems to be confident in the U.S.'s ability to counter Chinese threats. However, he seems to potentially underestimate their overall strength and overestimate U.S. capabilities. It is extremely important not to underestimate your opponent. If something can be capable, you should assume it is, unless it is proven not to be. With all of this information taken into consideration, the United States and her allies have a significant advantage in starting fleet power when compared to the Chinese Navy. However, starting fleet power is only half of the calculation. Production capacity is even more important in the event of war. In the Second World War, during the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, 8 U.S. battleships were sunk or damaged. Out of all the battleships sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor, every one was raised except for the Arizona, and all but 2, the Oklahoma and the Arizona, were put back into frontline service by the end of the war. The U.S. not only repaired most of the ships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor, but they significantly upgraded their capabilities. For example, the USS California went from looking like this to looking like this. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, the United States produced an impressive number of battleships. The U.S. produced 2 North Carolina-class battleships, 4 South Dakota-class battleships, and 4 Iowa-class battleships. During the opening year of the war, U.S. carrier losses were not insignificant. The U.S. lost the USS Lexington at the Battle of the Coral Sea and the USS Yorktown at the Battle of Midway. During the Battle of Guadalcanal and the naval engagements that surrounded it, the U.S. lost the USS Wasp and USS Hornet. To put these losses into context, the Battle of Midway is commonly seen as the turning point in the war. In a single battle, the Japanese lost the Akagi, Kaga, Soyu, and Hiryu. So, by the end of 1942, the U.S. had lost as many major fleet carriers as the Japanese. The major difference between the two nations was their production capacity. Japan's aircraft carriers were almost irreplaceable. Meanwhile, replacing carrier losses was relatively easy for the United States. During the 1940s, the U.S. would build 24 Essex-class aircraft carriers, including a new Hornet, a new Wasp, a new Yorktown, and a new Lexington. So, thanks to the United States' raw production capacity, the U.S. could bounce back from significant fleet carrier losses. The Japanese, on the other hand, could not. Though Japan started the war with an arguably stronger fleet, they ended the war with almost no navy at all. According to the U.S. Department of Defense 2023 report on the military and security developments involving the People's Republic of China, quote, China, the top ship-producing nation in the world by tonnage, is increasing its shipbuilding capacity for all naval classes, submarines, surface combatants, and auxiliary and amphibious ships. China also has developed unmanned underwater system. Publicly revealing a long-range system in 2019, China domestically produces naval gas turbine and diesel engines, as well as almost all shipboard weapons and electronic systems for its shipbuilding sector, making the industry nearly self-sufficient for all shipbuilding needs. A U.S. Navy unclassified briefing slide reveals just how far behind the U.S. is in terms of naval production capacity. China has over 230 times the production capacity of the United States. Most notably, China controls approximately 40% of the global commercial shipbuilding market. It is also believed that China has 50-plus dry docks that would be capable of accommodating an aircraft carrier. This information leads me to the conclusion that though the United States has superior starting forces, the United States would struggle to repair ships and replace losses. China seems to be in a relatively advantageous position and would likely be able to expand its fleet even during wartime. Though China may have the advantage of greater naval production capacity, it has the disadvantage of not having as much experience as the U.S. Navy. For example, China only recently acquired its first aircraft carrier with catapults. They will have to learn cyclic ops from the ground up, whereas the United States Navy has been doing those for the better part of a century. The U.S. Navy has had its share of challenges in recent years. There have been repeated recruitment shortfalls, and there's been a lack of confidence in the upper leadership. Though the United States certainly still has its advantages, the next president will have to do a lot of work to make the Navy great again. If you made it to this point in the video, I'd encourage you to like, comment, and subscribe if you love this type of naval history content. This video was made from notes and research that I did as part of a class on various types of ocean law and policy. Well, anyway, thanks for watching, and Godspeed.